The Nuts and Bolts of Writing, Season 2, a podcast where we talk about literature, the ins and outs of writing, and how to actually start writing.
Hey everyone, this is Tete DePunk, one of the co-hosts of The Nuts and Bolts of Writing. Today I will be interviewing author Nick Young, who submitted an impressive range of his respective stories: Oasis in issue 5, Alabama in issue 6, and his most recent story, Boomerang, to issue 7 of our literary zine, The Unconventional Courier. I've provided links to all 3 of his featured works in the description. Nick Young is a retired award-winning CBS News Correspondent. His writing has appeared in more than 24 publications, including the Pennsylvania Literary Journal, Fiction on the Web, Bookend Reviews, the Nonconformist Magazine, Sandpiper, the San Antonio Review, Flyover Magazine, Pigeon Review, Fiction Junkies, Typeslash Review, the Best of CaféLit 11, and volumes 1 and 2 of the Writer Shed Stories anthology. He lives outside of Chicago. You can find him on Twitter at NickU8716603 and Instagram at ZenBlues. From heavy social issues to the individual struggle, Nick Young's stories take the reader through searing and moving experiences of loss, growth, and the heart of the human spirit during the tumults of the modern century. Hello, Nick. Welcome to the Nuts and Bolts of Writing. We're thrilled to have you here today.
Tete, it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much. And we're going to be discussing your very impressive work, but also your approach to work, which really is evident in the quality of your writing. So the first question I have is, Nick, your work delves into the heart of human nature and social issues. Did your time as a CBS News correspondent influence your approach to writing?
Well, I think it did, or it has in a couple of respects. Certainly in terms of the stories that I covered and the awareness of social issues, that would be one aspect of it. And the other would be in terms of the mechanics of it. I spent my career writing for radio news, and that requires a particular approach to writing, which involves distillation, I think is the best way to put it. There are always time constraints when writing for a radio news program, and so there's no room for verbosity. You have to get to the heart of what you want to say it clearly, say it concisely, say it creatively, and so that has informed, I think, my approach to trying to write, especially in the short story form, which requires that kind of distillation. So yes, in both senses, I think from the perspective of social awareness of social issues, and then also in terms of the craft of writing as well.
This is very fascinating. It's something that's, often, I want to say, neglected in many approaches, especially for new writers or people who have discovered they have a knack for writing. I think sometimes the focus of communication is often overlooked, but what you've really shown in your work is really that clarity of communication, but also, like you said, getting to the point and conveying that point to the reader.
Yeah, I think that, and again, hearkening back to the work I did as a broadcast journalist, is that there is a premium on making every word count. Certainly in writing a radio script, as I say, I think we joke in my business that some of our best stuff ends up on the cutting room floor, and that's because it simply doesn't fit within the time constraints. So I think in my approach to writing fiction, there's this balance between making it clear, getting to the point of it, and yet not being so spare that you sacrifice the narrative or the coloration of the story of the characters. So it's been a balance for me, and frankly, since I started writing creatively, I had to find ways to make my writing, I think initially, more expansive than it was. Give myself permission to think broader and write broader, um, and then perhaps do some in the editing process, the rewriting process, do that sculpting to bring it to the point where I felt that it was right. It was a learning experience for me because, as I say, in writing for radio news, that writing is so tight that I found myself constricted by that initially when I began to write creatively, and I had to give myself, as I said, permission to relax a little bit and broaden that out.
That makes perfect sense. And, that's sort of it's kind of liberating when you can deal with, if you will, sort of a broader canvas, so to speak.
Yeah, I think so. And of course, since I write short stories, it's not that far off from what I was doing before because they're if I were doing a novel, then I would have to I think relax even more and find ways to broaden out even more. But with short stories, it seems like it's a good medium for me. I'm comfortable in exploring the subjects that I want to explore within the constraints of I don't know 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 words.
And then it's wonderful that you found that sort of that perfect medium to work with. And this ties into the second question. Would you say that your career as a news correspondent, did that give you the necessary structure for your writing work? Did that, as you had mentioned, do you feel that gave you better structure on how to construct your short stories, which I want to say I'm really impressed with the structure and the composition of your short stories?
Yeah, I think so very much. Just by way of explanation, I had years ago I had written a screenplay, and the typical length of a screenplay, at least when I wrote this, was about 100 pages. So it's about 1 minute of screen time for every page, and that was a pretty good length for a marketable screenplay. It was it was a murder mystery. It got some reading in Hollywood, but no one did anything with it. So it sat on the shelf for years. And then a friend of mine, a broadcast colleague who's also a published writer in Chicago, said, why don't you take that screenplay and turn it into a novel? So I thought, well, it's just been lying on the shelf. Maybe I'll give it a whirl. So I took the screenplay and I began to flesh it out and turn it into a novelized form. And I bring that up because writing a screenplay, for anyone who's ever done it, I found it very comfortable because, again, there's very spare description of what's going on. You have to be very clear with every word, and then so much of it rides on the dialogue. But it was comfortable for me as a transition point then to say, well, all right, the screenplay didn't work out, the novel is coming along, but why don't I explore some different themes, not genre fiction, but some more literary fiction, some things that I want to talk about, and do that in the short story form. So it made it, I think, easier for me to step into that and, again, use the training that I had, use the discipline that I had to in constructing the story and making it work in that way. So yeah, I would say that my training as a journalist had a great deal of influence on the work that I do now.
And this is wonderful to hear. Not I sort of think that today, I think especially with many writers going into it, they don't think quite enough about the discipline or structure of the craft. So this was very wonderful to hear how that gave you, the structure, the approach, and very fascinating to learn about, the screenplay writing, which, like you said, with its sparse description and the fact that it's very heavily reliant on dialogue, for its pace and flow. This was really fascinating to learn about. And this ties into the third question. When you approach a story, I noticed that you said you prefer thematic literature over something that's limited to genre. So when you're approaching a story, do you focus first on the plot, the character, or is it theme first that you think about when you want to, what for a particular message you want to convey to the reader?
I think it depends on where I am in kind of what is triggering me creatively at the moment, because I've written a lot of thematic works that have social and cultural messages within them, but I've also written some genre pieces. I've written some horror fiction in the style of Poe, because I find that I revel in the use of language as it was used then. And I've had some success with some pieces being published in that vein. I've also written some humorous pieces as well. So it depends. I may get an idea. Ideas can come from many different directions. There are some things that I have tried to explore in terms of the cultural issues, diversity, prejudice, racism, homophobia, the issues of battered women, and those typically, I typically think of those things in broader terms, like what I want to write. I'll back up just a bit, if I may, and mention
Sure.
a story that I wrote. One of the first stories I got published was a story called Migrante, which was about migrant workers, Mexican migrant workers, and the attempts to pin a rape and murder on this one migrant, this kid who was in the small community, who was there with his parents. They were migrant workers, and the rape and murder were committed by the son of a powerful local businessman, and it was all about the power structure in this small community and the racism involved, and trying to pin the crime on this poor kid who barely spoke any English whatsoever. And this stemmed from the fact that I grew up in a community in a small town in Illinois, where there were migrant workers who would come in every summer and pick asparagus. The asparagus crop was harvested by these migrant workers, and then it was canned in a local factory. The migrant workers would move on. And growing up, they were just brown faces around town, but that's all I knew about them. I had no way of knowing what their lives were like, but I thought I will explore this in this particular story. Their lives were harsh. They moved from place to place. And so that was the basis of this particular story. But it harkened back to part of my past, but my central focus was on let me point up something that I felt from growing up in a small town, which is that there are power structures, there are hierarchies, and there is prejudices. And if you happen to have a white skin, you're fine. If your skin is not so white, then something else is going on here. And so that was the genesis of that story. And many of the stories I take from that kind of a perspective. What can I do with these particular issues? How can I what's the storyline that I can construct, and what characters will work within this to illustrate what I'm trying to get to?
This is very fascinating, and I particularly love how you brought to light, sort of the power structure, the hierarchy, and the sort of the privilege hierarchy, if you will, of small town. I myself, live in a small town I would want to say, technically speaking, I was born and living in a small town, and you definitely feel the more sharp sting of those unfortunate power structures, which many people abuse and exploit. So I definitely understand where you're coming from and how that deals in with, race, ethnicity, even in our modern age when things have become more homogenized. There are still those very, very sharp, issues at play since, I myself, just to put it bluntly out there, small town, predominantly white. It's very rural, where I am in Pennsylvania. So a lot of prejudice, especially racial and ethnic. And like you said, if you have white skin, there's certainly privileges and passes you get. Sort of in my case, I'm white passing, despite being Latino from my mother's side, and I did experience sort of this secondhand discrimination from other people, especially when it was directed towards my mother, especially concerning linguistics, things like that, suspicions of all the sort of negative stereotypes that are unfairly associated. But this was very riveting to hear about your story, Migrante, and what you explored in that, and also how you approach the bigger scheme and theme of things, the bigger picture of it. And so I think you pretty much had answered the fourth question, which tied into the third question. When you're tackling a heavy issue in your work, how do you face that challenge? Do you feel like it's a thing of research, understanding, or is there another holistic or compartmentalized approach that you take when you're going to tackle a heavy issue in a story or a different type of work?
No, I would say that I do minimal research, because virtually everything that I write stems from it resonates with me, on some level where a lot of research is unnecessary, and much of it can stem from episodes in the past. I'll do research when necessary to pinpoint a place, to get a little bit more comfortable in a description of a place. But that's pretty much all I need to do there. So much of it comes from, again, my own experience. Another quick example, and I grew up in a small town and experienced, my mother was she came over to this country after the Second World War and married my dad. She was from Greece, so she had Mediterranean coloring, and it was a little darker shade than most of the Swedish people in this particular area. And so I grew up with a little darker skin, and I paid the price as a kid by being called, racial names, even as a first grader in this community. So I felt it firsthand. One other quick story that I wrote called Flight was stemmed from an episode in college in which our graduate assistant, who oversaw the dorm section that I lived in, a wonderful man named Denny Gavaya, went to a club. He was from Guyana, and he was Black. He went to a club one night. This is years ago. And I went to the University of Missouri, so it was in a section of Missouri called Little Dixie. So there was a lot of Southern influence, even though it was in the center of the state. He went to a club one Saturday night, and he was set upon by some idiots, and he was so terrified that he ran into the woods nearby and hid out there until finally it was safe for him to emerge. I think the police came out and they looked for him. And this was a guy who was like, he was an athlete. He was in wonderful shape, but he was so terrified by this that he felt that he needed to flee for his life. And this became the basis of a story that I used with that to highlight this problem with racial hatred. So I think I look for I guess, of course, I want to make the characters as real as I can, and I want them to try to get at the heart of what I'm trying to say there and illustrate that. I don't want to be heavy-handed about it. I hope that it doesn't come across in that way. I want people to get the message clearly. And for me, I mean, so much of it, Tete, is the use of language that is critical to me to make the words count, make the sentences work in the way that they should without um, this fine line between being descriptive and being flowery and writing purple prose. I shy away from that as much as I can. I try and look for ways to be direct and but find ways to fashion the words perhaps in a little different way than some others might, but make them more creative and descriptive and evocative.
This is really fascinating to, when not only how you're, like I said, approaching the issue, but also communication. And, that is such a temptation for many, is to, veer into, purple prose. And that's kind of the stumbling block, for many writers. But, I think your approach is that, it's usually clear communication. And like you, I also appreciate, the use of words that are not often used. And it's not really to, show off any kind of verbosity or, any kind of impressive vocabulary or anything. But sometimes when you find a word, it's the definition of that word, that you can express a whole concept and idea in just a single word. And sometimes it's that wonderful brevity that, helps convey the idea. And, it may seem a little bit different than what's favored in, trendy circles, or, what's being, pushed out there for standard usage. But sometimes it is nice to, find sort of a neglected word that can really bring to life what you have in mind and what you're trying to convey to the audience.
Yeah, I think so. And if I'll use an example from blues music. There's a very famous blues musician by the name of Honey Boy Edwards, who was one of the old Delta blues guys who played with Robert Johnson and from that particular era of music. And I bring this up because anyone who listens to blues and listens to guitar players play blues, too frequently I find they get caught up in how many notes they can play, and it becomes a kind of exercise in excess, if you will. Honey Boy Edwards said, "You can kill a man with one note." And I think he said that to illustrate the point that it's not how many notes you play, it's what they say, even that one note. And I think that it's true in writing as well. You don't have to go overboard if you're using the right word and using it in the proper way. It's rather akin to print on the page too. Sometimes when you think about it, it's the white space that makes the print work. When you think about writing, and one of my favorite forms of probably my favorite form of poetry is haiku. So there you have a structure of 5, 7, 5 syllables, 3 lines, and that's it. And you got to make those work. So it can be, for me, it can be a case of I sometimes will be affected by the writers I'm reading, and then I will try to see, is there something I could do with the mood I'm getting from these writers and work into a story of my own. I did a story recently that was published called Jezebel, the inspiration from it came from reading one of my favorite writers, Cormac McCarthy, and his particular style of writing. Now, I don't mean to slavishly emulate him. I couldn't if I tried. But what is it about that work and his tone and style that I could try and make my own and work into a story? I had inspiration some time ago from reading Faulkner. One particular paragraph that I read struck such a chord with me that I said, I'm going to write something that evokes this mood that he is suggesting here. So I wrote a 500 word flash fiction piece about a young girl and her grandmother. But so it can, as I say, as you know yourself, inspiration can come at you from some unexpected directions, and in many different forms. It can be an odd character, it can be a situation, it can be, as I say, reading something that suggests perhaps a new approach. So I try and keep open to everything.
And this is really great. This is, just to have that kind of, clarity of mind when approaching the story, because a lot of people can be tempted to, like you said, go overboard, and exercise in excess. And well, I guess another question that would probably, also be related to this, when you're thinking of the structure, like, beginning, middle, and end, for you, when do you feel that a story has reached its end? When do you know to stop adding and end the story? Because when I read your stories, like the ones you've submitted to us, I noticed that you ended on a very perfect and poignant note, like exactly where to cut off. And that's something where, a lot of writers struggle with. They may add more, or they try to tuck in an unnecessary epilogue, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think I don't know. Sometimes the sometimes the end, the punchline emerges before I even start writing.
Why?
If I can use that, I'm working on a story right now where I've got one word in mind, and it has a kind of a double meaning. But I thought to myself, in thinking about how I'm going to work this, it became, well, who is going to use this word and in what context? And then when I had that set, then I said, well, that is going to be the end of the story, and I'll work toward that particular end. I can't. That is that doesn't happen every time. I think I keep working with the story to where I feel it is the logical conclusion, and then I'll kind of put that exclamation point there. Uh, but it emerges as I work through the story, I think, for the most part. Or I guess I could, again, let me go back to the story that I mentioned called Flight, which was suggested by this horrible episode involving my friend in college.
Right.
The one thing that the character in the story says at one point, in midpoint in the story, he's being pursued himself, and he says, I am not going to end up like Emmett Till. And if you know the story of Emmett Till, then you know exactly what that means.
Yes,
And
exactly.
right. So at the end of the story, at the climax of the story, he says one more time, I'm not going to end up like Emmett Till, and he runs toward the light that he sees in a distant farmhouse. So sometimes it's again, it's to bring full circle the theme of the story, or something in that story that I want recapitulated. But it tends to work itself out in the process. So I mean, there's no hard and fast rule.
Yeah, this is really, how do I say this? And this is a very good lesson to learn, you sort of have to learn through experience, because, a lot of people may not have, the end or the end goal in sight. And, a lot of writers just, how do I say, for lack of a better word, they're sort of going into the water with a rudderless boat. And yeah. And so this is really good to hear, that how you have this really well structured even before, you've completely written it. And like when, for example, the middle can always be the most challenging part for a writer. For you, does the middle come easier, or would that be the beginning, or once you start to lay everything in place, does it all just kind of fall into its own flow, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it does. I think I mean the hardest pass for me is the first writing, which is to try to get through and make sure that the plot is working. Uh, and then after that, it becomes a much easier to go back through it and then make those refinements. But uh, but I would say it has its way of falling into place. I don't I usually don't have any trouble with any particular section of a story. I don't have any particular trouble with the midsection of the story. It all has its way of working out. Now I may rework it. I mean certainly, um, but that's through the process of revision, and it usually doesn't require making any 180-degree turns. It's much more a case of refining than it is abandoning major parts of the story.
This is, and what you said about not abandoning major parts of the story, that's something I think many writers should keep to heart, because when many people do revisions, they're doing some very drastic things. Even I myself, in my own personal creative work, I've done some very major 180 sort of changing horses in midstream, as they say. So
Yeah,
that's yeah.
excuse me, but I mean, I certainly have had episodes like that as well. It typically I don't, but I mean, yeah, I have. Well, I mean, I've abandoned pieces because I start them and I say this is just not working. I try, I think, to give it a chance, though, even though I feel trepidation about getting into some stories and work. Like I don't know where this is going to go here. I don't know how well this is working. I try to be patient with myself because that tends to be an early reaction. I mean, I'm also a artist and a painter, and I frequently have that same feeling when I'm working on a piece of art that this is terrible, and I should throw it away. You got to be patient with yourself and just give yourself a little bit of space, and you typically will work out.
And that's such good advice. It really is. And also very fascinating to learn that you're also an artist as well, and with painting as well. That's very fascinating to hear. And I do wish we had more time. And I'm afraid we have, time for one last question. And that last question would be, for the parting question, what advice would you give to writers out there? Like just what would be your like most basic streamlined advice?
I would say write, read and write and find your own voice. Keep at it. There's no other way to go about it. And then don't have the courage to put yourself out there and take some chances and be ready for the rejection, but also be prepared to have your work accepted too. I mean, there's no other way around it. It's just stay with it, believe in yourself, and it will happen.
Well, this is absolutely very sound advice. And so far, this interview, I do wish we had more time, but it was an absolute masterclass in not only communication, but how to approach structure, but, also just sort of experiencing life and human nature while trying to convey it, through the medium of literature. And this was just a refreshing masterclass, if you will. And, you know, we are absolutely honored to have you again. I'm hoping that we can invite you again, for another interview. And just to extend it out there, you're always welcome at the Unconventional Courier for any works. We're always happy to see you. And thank you so much, Nick, for your time. Thank you for your exceptional insight. And this was just an absolutely refreshing and, absolutely fantastic experience. So thank you so much.
Well, Tete, I appreciate it so much. It's been a delight talking with you, and I'm happy to renew the conversation at any time. And again, I'm so grateful for the reception that you've given my work, and I'll keep writing, and everybody else do the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you again soon. And all the best to you. Please keep in touch, and thank you again so much.
I will. Bye bye. Thanks. Have a great day.
Goodbye. Thank you.